Disrespect, in its myriad forms, triggers some of humanity's most primal and predictable responses. Across cultures, generations, and individual personalities, the violation of social dignity consistently produces recognizable patterns of emotional retaliation. These reactions, whether explosive and immediate or suppressed and delayed, share a fundamental commonality. They bind the offended party emotionally to the offender. This emotional tethering represents a psychological trap wherein the victim remains invested in the perpetrator's actions, thoughts, and validation, thereby granting the disrespectful party ongoing power over their emotional state. The conventional spectrum of responses spans two apparent extremes that nonetheless converge in their ultimate consequence. On one end exists the volcanic reaction, the immediate, visceral outburst characterized by raised voices, heated language, and demonstrative displays of wounded pride. This response, though seemingly powerful in its intensity, paradoxically reveals profound vulnerability by demonstrating exactly how effectively the disrespect has penetrated emotional defenses. The volume becomes a direct measure of hurt. The theatricality of response confesses the depth of the injury. On the opposite end of the spectrum resides a silent absorber, the individual who swallows the insult without immediate reaction, storing the resentment in psychological compartments where it ferments into passive-aggressive behaviors, subtle sabotage, or emotional withdrawal. This approach creates a delayed action poison that contaminates relationships over time, often leaking out in unrelated contexts or through indirect expressions of hostility. The Sigma paradigm, beyond conventional reaction patterns. The Sigma male's approach to disrespect constitutes a distinct psychological paradigm that transcends traditional categorizations of response. This methodology doesn't simply represent a variation on existing themes, but rather a fundamentally different philosophical orientation toward interpersonal conflict and personal boundaries. Where the conventional mind anticipates confrontation, the Sigma individual delivers calculation. Where society expects pushback, he offers perspective. Where cultural scripts demand a fight, he presents a refusal to be enlisted into combat. Psychological architecture, the internal mechanisms of the Sigma response. Cognitive reappraisal as foundational process. At the heart of the Sigma response lies a sophisticated cognitive process known in psychological literature as reappraisal, the deliberate reinterpretation of an emotional stimulus to alter its effective impact. Where most individuals process disrespect through what might be termed the honor injury framework, interpreting the act as an attack on social standing requiring defense, the Sigma male engages in what could be called diagnostic reappraisal. This approach systematically transforms the emotional event into an analytical opportunity. The observational stance, from participant to analyst. During this reappraisal process, the Sigma male effectively transitions from participant in the conflict to observer of it. This metacognitive position, the ability to observe one's own situation from a detached perspective, enables a form of psychological binocular vision. He simultaneously experiences the emotional impact while observing the interaction, as if studying a behavioral specimen. This dual awareness creates what might be termed emotional parallax, the slight difference in perspective between feeling and observing that allows for depth perception in social dynamics. The 6 pillars of Sigma response, a detailed examination. Pillar 1, transformation of disrespect into intelligence. The initial and most fundamental pillar of the Sigma response involves the systematic conversion of emotional injury into strategic intelligence. This process begins with what might appear to observers as a puzzling non-reaction, a silence or neutral response that conventional interpretation often misreads as shock, defeat, or failure to comprehend. In reality, this apparent non-response represents intense cognitive activity redirected inward. The intelligence gathered during this process falls into several distinct categories. Character intelligence. What does this behavior reveal about the perpetrator's fundamental character structure? Does it demonstrate impulsivity or calculation? Does it reveal underlying insecurity or overconfidence? Does it indicate consistent values or situational ethics? Relational intelligence. What does this behavior indicate about how the perpetrator perceives a relationship? Does it suggest they view it as hierarchical, competitive, transactional? Does it reveal unspoken expectations or resentments? Strategic intelligence. What tactical or strategic objective does this behavior attempt to achieve? Is it designed to test boundaries, establish dominance, provoke a reaction for entertainment or information gathering, redirect attention from the perpetrator's vulnerabilities, predictive intelligence. Based on this behavior, what future actions might be anticipated from this individual? Under what circumstances might similar behavior recur? What conditions might trigger escalation or variation? This transformation of disrespect from wound to wisdom represents what might be termed alchemical cognition, the conversion of base emotional reactions into refined strategic understanding. The insult itself becomes incidental, the revelation it provides becomes invaluable. Pillar 2. Character classification and behavioral adjustment. The second pillar involves a systematic process of character assessment followed by calibrated behavioral adjustment. Sigma males operate according to what might be termed a behavioral ledger, a continuous, often unconscious tracking of interactions that allows for character assessment based on empirical evidence rather than professed intentions or social convenience. This classification system distinguishes fundamentally between what might be termed incidents of imperfection and revelations of character. The former category include behaviors stemming from understandable human frailty, momentary lapses in judgment, stress-induced irritability, unintentional offenses resulting from different communication styles or cultural frameworks. These incidents, while potentially hurtful, don't fundamentally alter the Sigma's assessment of character because they don't reveal deliberate malice or fundamental disregard. The latter category, revelations of character, encompasses behaviors that demonstrate deliberate choices reflecting core values and priorities. These include premeditated boundary violations, disrespect delivered with clear awareness of its impact, betrayals that require planning rather than impulse, and patterns of behavior that consistently prioritize the perpetrator's interests at deliberate cost to others. These behaviors aren't classified as mistakes but as revelations, windows into fundamental character structure that no apology can retroactively obscure. This distinction explains what observers often misinterpret as inconsistency in the Sigma's responses. They may witness him forgiving what appears to be a major transgression, while apparently holding a grudge over what seems a minor slight. This apparent contradiction resolves when understood through the character revelation framework. The major transgression may have resulted from understandable human frailty under extreme pressure, thereby falling into the imperfection category that merits grace. The minor slight may have revealed a fundamental character flaw, a deliberate choice to disrespect despite full awareness of its impact, thereby providing a character revelation that no amount of apology can retroactively erase. Pillar 3. Silent reconfiguration of relational architecture. The third pillar represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated and frequently misunderstood aspect of the Sigma response, the silent, internal reconfiguration of relational architecture following character reassessment. Unlike conventional responses that involve confrontation, boundary declaration, or emotional display, the Sigma approach involves what might be termed relational recalibration, a quiet restructuring of the relationship's fundamental parameters that occurs entirely internally and manifests only through behavioral adjustment. This process resembles what in computer science might be called background processing, extensive computational work that occurs without visible interface activity. The Sigma male, following character revelation through disrespect, engages in extensive internal evaluation of the relationship's value, costs, and appropriate positioning within his life structure. This evaluation considers multiple factors: the demonstrated character of the individual, the pattern of interactions, the emotional and psychological cost of maintenance, the alignment with personal values and objectives, and the opportunity cost of continued investment. Pillar 4. Autonomous temporal framing of consequences. The fourth pillar involves what might be termed temporal autonomy, the Sigma's insistence on operating according to his own internal timeline for processing and response rather than conforming to social expectations regarding appropriate reaction windows. This represents a fundamental rejection of what psychologist Robert Cialdini might term urgency framing, the social convention that emotional responses and relational consequences should follow immediately upon offensive behavior to be perceived as legitimate. This latency period is frequently misinterpreted by perpetrators as forgiveness, forgetfulness, or weakness. Having received no immediate pushback, they assume the offense has been absorbed without consequence, often leading to repetition or escalation of disrespectful behavior. This misinterpretation represents a critical error in social calculation, as it fails to recognize the Sigma's different processing methodology. During this latency period, the Sigma is engaged in multiple cognitive processes. Pattern recognition. He observes whether the disrespect represents an isolated incident or part of a behavioral pattern. Multiple data points over time provide more reliable character assessment than a single incident, regardless of its severity. Strategic calculation. He evaluates the most effective response timing based on multiple variables, including the perpetrator's likely reaction patterns, the social context, and his own emotional equilibrium. Emotional processing. He allows initial emotional reactions to subside through natural attenuation rather than forced suppression or immediate expression, ensuring that eventual responses stem from considered judgment rather than reactive emotion. Consequence design. He contemplates not just immediate reaction but long-term relational restructuring, considering how different responses will affect not just his relationship but his broader relational ecosystem. When consequences eventually manifest, often weeks or months after the offense, they frequently catch the perpetrator completely off guard. The extended temporal gap has severed, in their mind, the connection between cause and effect. They find themselves facing relational adjustments they cannot connect to specific behaviors, creating profound confusion. This confusion often manifests as bewilderment. Why is he acting differently all of a sudden? Or attribution error. He must be going through something else unrelated to me. Pillar 5. Withdrawal of invisible protection. The fifth pillar involves what might be termed the retraction of invisible advocacy, the silent withdrawal of the Sigma's protective influence in contexts where the perpetrator is absent or vulnerable. This represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated and least visible aspects of the Sigma response, as it operates entirely outside the perpetrator's awareness until its effect becomes indirectly apparent through changed social dynamics. Prior to character revelation through disrespect, the Sigma male typically functions as what might be called an unseen advocate for those within his circle of trust. This advocacy manifests in multiple contexts, defending absent friends against criticism, vouching for their character in professional or social settings, offering subtle support during vulnerability, and generally functioning as a stabilizing influence in their social ecosystem. This protection operates quietly, often without the beneficiary's explicit knowledge, reflecting the Sigma's preference for action over declaration. The Sigma's transition from advocate to observer follows a predictable pattern. Initially, he may offer minimal, non-committal responses when the individual faces criticism. I see your point rather than you're misunderstanding him. Gradually, these responses become more neutral or redirecting. That's an interesting perspective, or let's talk about something else. Eventually, he may simply remain silent during discussions about the individual, allowing criticisms to stand unchallenged and compliments to go unendorsed. This progression from active defense through passive neutrality to deliberate non-engagement communicates volumes to observant third parties about the changed relationship status. Pillar 6. Strategic invalidation of social games. The sixth and final pillar involves what might be termed game theoretical nullification, the systematic dismantling of social power games through refusal to participate in their established parameters. This represents perhaps the most counterintuitive and psychologically sophisticated aspect of the Sigma response, as it defeats adversarial social maneuvers not through superior play but through fundamental rule rejection. Social creatures instinctively engage in what might be termed status games, interactions designed to establish, test, or negotiate relative position within social hierarchies. These games follow predictable patterns: challenge and response, insult and retaliation, dominance display and submission or counter-display. The games rely on mutual participation and shared understanding of rules and objectives. Disrespect often functions as an opening move in such games, a provocation designed to elicit a response that establishes relative positioning. This shift manifests through several characteristic responses. Literal acceptance, responding to provocative statements with literal interpretation that ignores their subtextual challenge. For example, responding to "you wouldn't understand" with "you're probably right" rather than defending one's comprehension abilities. Agreement without concession, acknowledging the superficial content of a challenge while disregarding its confrontational intent. That's an interesting perspective in response to direct criticism. Contextual redirection, shifting the conversation to an entirely different topic or frame, effectively declaring the game irrelevant to current priorities. Behavioral continuation, simply continuing with, previous activity as if the challenge hadn't occurred, communicating through action that the provocation doesn't merit interruption of more important matters. These responses achieve what might be termed game collapse, the disintegration of the adversarial framework through absence of expected participation. The perpetrator finds their carefully constructed challenge meeting not resistance but irrelevance. Their psychological investment in the game, the emotional preparation, strategic calculation, and anticipation of satisfying conflict dissipates into empty space. The energy they invested returns not as satisfying conflict, but as awkward anticlimax. Philosophical foundations, the worldview underpinning Sigma responses. Disrespect as data, the informational paradigm. At the philosophical core of the Sigma response lies what might be termed the informational paradigm, a fundamental reconceptualization of disrespect from emotional injury to behavioral data. This paradigm shift represents more than mere emotional regulation. It constitutes a different ontological understanding of social interactions themselves. This orientation reflects several philosophical commitments. Empirical relational assessment. Relationships are evaluated based on observed behavior rather than professed intentions, social convenience, or emotional attachment. Longitudinal character analysis. Character is assessed through patterns over time rather than isolated incidents, with greater weight given to behavior under conditions of perceived advantage or diminished consequence. Psychological sovereignty. Emotional responses are recognized as internal events to be understood and managed rather than imperatives to be obeyed or expressions of fundamental truth. Strategic patience. Time is viewed as an analytical tool allowing for pattern recognition and considered response rather than a pressure-forcing immediate reaction. The sovereignty principle, internal validation versus social negotiation. A second philosophical foundation underpinning Sigma responses involve what might be termed the sovereignty principle, the commitment to internal rather than external validation. This represents a fundamental rejection of what social psychologist Mark Leary terms sociometer theory, the concept that self-esteem functions primarily as a gauge of social acceptance. This sovereignty manifests in several ways. Boundary autonomy. Boundaries are established based on personal values and psychological needs rather than social expectations or negotiation. Validation internality. Self-worth is derived from alignment with internal standards rather than social approval or competitive dominance. Temporal independence. Response timing follows internal processing needs rather than social expectations regarding appropriate reaction windows. Game theoretical sovereignty. Social games are evaluated based on their alignment with personal values rather than their inherent social validity, with participation determined by choice rather than obligation. The economy principle, resource allocation in relationships. A third philosophical foundation involves what might be termed the economy principle, the conceptualization of emotional, cognitive, and temporal resources as finite commodities requiring prudent allocation. This economic model of relationship stands in contrast to conventional romantic or obligation-based models that often prioritize endless investment regardless of return. Within this economic framework, every relationship represents an investment portfolio comprising various resources: time, emotional energy, social capital, cognitive attention, and vulnerability. Disrespect functions as what might be termed a valuation event, new information that requires reassessment of the relationship's worth and appropriate resource allocation. This economic orientation explains several characteristic Sigma behaviors. Gradual withdrawal. Rather than dramatic confrontation, the Sigma often implements what might be termed incremental divestment, gradually reducing resource allocation to match reassessed relationship value. Silent reclassification. Relationship categories shift internally based on demonstrated character and value, with behavioral changes following these reclassifications without explicit declaration. Advocacy retraction. Protective resources are reallocated from those who have demonstrated unworthiness to those who have demonstrated worth, following principles of investment efficiency rather than emotional obligation. Game avoidance. Status games are recognized as resource-intensive with minimal return, leading to systematic avoidance through rule rejection rather than superior play. This economic approach often appears calculating or cold to those accustomed to relationships governed by emotional immediacy or social obligation. However, from the Sigma perspective, it represents not coldness but clarity, a recognition that resources are finite and that prudent allocation represents not just self-protection but responsibility to those relationships that genuinely merit investment. Psychological implications and social consequences. The perpetrators experience confusion, attribution error, and retroactive realization. The sigma response generates a characteristic psychological experience of perpetrators that differs markedly from conventional responses to disrespect. This experience typically unfolds in several stages. Initial misinterpretation. Following disrespect without immediate reaction, the perpetrator typically interprets silence as victory, weakness, or forgiveness. This often leads to repetition or escalation, as the absence of consequence suggests the behavior is permissible or effective. Growing perplexity, as behavioral changes gradually manifest, reduce contact, diminish sharing, withdrawal of advocacy, the perpetrator experiences confusion, unable to connect these changes to specific actions. Due to temporal gaps and lack of explicit confrontation, they often engage in attribution error, ascribing the changes to external factors, stress, business, other relationships, rather than their own behavior. Retroactive realization. Eventually, often through observation of patterns or third-party feedback, the perpetrator recognizes a connection between their behavior and the sigma's withdrawal. This realization typically arrives long after the opportunity for course correction has passed, as the sigma's internal reclassification has solidified into behavioral patterns resistant to change. Existential disorientation. The most psychologically sophisticated perpetrators may experience what might be termed game-theoretical disorientation, the unsettling realization that their entire framework for social navigation, challenge and response, apology and forgiveness, conflict and resolution, doesn't apply to this individual. This can generate profound anxiety as fundamental social assumptions prove inadequate. This experience proves particularly disconcerting because it violates conventional social scripts that govern conflict and reconciliation. The perpetrator finds themselves in uncharted psychological territory without navigational markers, often vacillating between confusion, frustration, and retroactive regret. Observer perceptions, misinterpretation, projection, and eventual recognition. Third-party observers of sigma responses typically undergo their own process of interpretation that often begins with misunderstanding and gradually progresses toward recognition. Initial mischaracterization. Observers often misinterpret the sigma's initial non-response as weakness, obliviousness, or defeat. Those accustomed to conventional conflict dynamics may view the lack of immediate reaction as failure to defend oneself adequately. Progressive confusion. As behavioral changes manifest gradually, observers often struggle to connect them to specific events. The extended temporal gap between cause and effect, combined with the sigma's silence regarding his reasoning, creates narrative discontinuity that observers attempt to bridge through projection or speculation. Eventual pattern recognition. Observant individuals eventually recognize the correlation between disrespect and behavioral adjustment, often noting the sigma's consistency in applying his principles across different relationships. This recognition typically generates either admiration for his consistency or discomfort with his perceived inflexibility, depending on the observer's own values and relational styles. Social repositioning. Over time, observers often adjust their own behavior toward both the sigma and those who have disrespected him, recognizing that disrespect carries consequences that, while delayed and unannounced, prove more consistent and final in conventional reactions. This observational process often leads to what might be termed reputational crystallization, the solidification of the sigma's reputation as someone whose boundaries, while unstated, are inviolable and whose responses, while delayed, are inevitable. This reputation often serves as preventive protection, as potential disrespect becomes tempered by awareness of likely consequences. Psychological benefits for the sigma: integrity preservation, resource conservation, and authentic connection. The sigma approach to disrespect generates several psychological benefits that reinforce its continued implementation. Integrity preservation. By responding based on internal assessment rather than social pressure, the sigma maintains alignment between values and behavior, reducing cognitive dissonance and enhancing self-respect. Resource conservation. The avoidance of emotional confrontations, social games, and performative conflicts conserves emotional and cognitive resources for more meaningful pursuits and relationships. Predictable environment creation. The consistent application of principles creates a social environment where behavior generates predictable consequences, reducing uncertainty and anxiety in relationships. Authentic connection facilitation. By quietly removing disrespectful individuals from his circle, the Sigma creates space for relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social obligation or convenience. Psychological sovereignty reinforcement. Each implementation of the Sigma response reinforces its independence from social validation games, strengthening internal reference points and reducing susceptibility to manipulation. These benefits create a self-reinforcing cycle. Successful implementation of Sigma principles generate psychological rewards that motivate continued application, which in turn generates further rewards. This cycle often leads to what might be termed response crystallization, the gradual solidification of the Sigma approach into a consistent, almost automatic response pattern that requires decreasing conscious effort over time. Limitations and considerations, contextual appropriateness and potential pitfalls. While the Sigma response offers significant psychological benefits, it is not without limitations and potential pitfalls that merit consideration. Contextual appropriateness. The Sigma approach may prove less effective in contexts requiring immediate boundary enforcement, such as professional settings with clear hierarchies, or in relationships where explicit communication is culturally or personally expected. Misinterpretation risks. The subtlety of Sigma responses carries inherent risks of misinterpretation, potentially allowing disrespectful behavior to continue or escalate before consequences manifest. Relational costs. The finality of Sigma reclassifications may prematurely terminate relationships that could have been repaired through explicit communication and mutual adjustment. Social perception management. The Sigma's reluctance to explain his reasoning may generate social perceptions of aloofness, arrogance, or emotional deficiency that carry their own social costs. Emotional processing considerations. The emphasis on analytical response over emotional expression may, in some individuals, lead to emotional bypassing rather than healthy processing, potentially creating long-term psychological consequences. Cultural variability. The effectiveness and appropriateness of Sigma responses vary across cultural contexts, with some cultures valuing explicit conflict resolution over subtle behavioral adjustment. These limitations suggest that the Sigma response, while psychologically sophisticated, represents not a universal solution, but a specific approach that proves most effective in particular contexts and for individuals with specific psychological architectures. Its implementation requires not rigid adherence, but contextual intelligence and self-awareness regarding both benefits and potential costs. Synthesis and conclusion. The Sigma response is integrated psychological system. The Sigma response to disrespect represents not a collection of isolated techniques, but an integrated psychological system grounded in specific philosophical commitments and implemented through consistent behavioral patterns. This system emerges from several interconnected principles. Informational paradigm. Disrespect functions primarily as behavioral data revealing character rather than emotional injury requiring retaliation. Sovereignty principle. Self-worth and behavioral standards derive from internal reference points rather than social negotiation or validation. Economy framework. Relational resources are finite and allocated based on demonstrated character and mutual value rather than obligation or emotional immediacy. Temporal autonomy. Processing and response follow internal timelines, prioritizing pattern recognition and consider judgment over social expectations of immediacy. Behavioral consistency. External behavior aligns with internal assessment through gradual adjustment rather than dramatic declaration. Game theoretical independence. Social status games are evaluated based on their inherent value and alignment with personal principles rather than accepted as obligatory social scripts. These principles manifest behaviorally through the 6 pillars: transforming disrespect into intelligence, classifying character and adjusting behavior accordingly, silently reconfiguring relational architecture, operating on autonomous timelines, withdrawing invisible protection, and invalidating social games through non-participation. Ultimately, the Sigma approach to disrespect reflects what might be termed psychological sovereignty, the commitment to define one's worth internally, establish boundaries autonomously, allocate resources prudently, and engage relationships intentionally rather than reactively. In a social world often governed by immediate emotional reactions and conventional conflict scripts, this sovereignty represents not just a different response to disrespect, but a different way of being in the world. One that prioritizes clarity over chaos, intelligence over injury, and considered action over theatrical reaction.